On the 31st October 1917, as daylight faded across the Negev desert, Australian Light Horse divisions secured the town of Beersheba, bringing to a close a crucial battle in the Sinai-Palestine campaign of World War I. Decisive victory at Beersheba fell to one of the last great charges of mounted troops in history. As Australian Light Horse divisions captured the town and secured crucial water wells, their success also marked the beginning of the end of the war in the Middle East. This came exactly a year to the day after success at Beersheba. In this portrayal of the battle, discover how events unfolded and explore features of the broader history of the Sinai-Palestine campaign of World War I. On the 31st October 1917, in the Negev Desert, north of the Sinai Peninsula, British, Australian, and New Zealand armies of the Egyptian Expeditionary Force fought a day-long battle to take the town of Beersheba. Success at Beersheba was a significant moment in the broader Sinai-Palestine offensive, which had begun in January 1915 with the Ottoman raids upon the Suez Canal. In the history of the Middle Eastern theatre of World War I, the Battle of Beersheba was a pivot upon which turned the fortunes of the Allied efforts against the Central Powers of the German and Ottoman empires. After two failed attempts to take Gaza, it demonstrated the success of maneuver warfare and the power of mounted troopers to rapidly redefine the outcome of a battle. Decisive victory at Beersheba fell to one of the last great charges in history, in which men of the Australian Light Horse swept into the town's centre to secure crucial water wells, along the way engaging in fierce hand-to-hand combat with entrenched Ottoman defenders. Despite outnumbering the Ottoman garrison at Beersheba by more than 10 to 1, were it not for the Light Horse charge in the late afternoon, the town would not have fallen to Allied attack before nightfall. Nor would so many of the crucial wells have survived a more protracted fight. General Edmund Allenby, commander of the Egyptian Expeditionary Force for the southern Palestine offensive, later summarized, "The Turks at Beersheba were undoubtedly taken completely by surprise, a surprise from which the dash of London troops and yeomanry, finely supported by their artillery, never gave them time to recover. The charge of the Australian Light Horse completed their defeat." The Ottoman defense lines around Beersheba included a system of both shallow and deeper trench lines, from which soldiers would fire from ground level, either in prone positions or standing within the deeper trenches and firing over the parapet. Whilst the shape of the trenches varied, two forms were typical, including a broad arrow shape, which allowed for machine gunners at the tip to fire forward and enfilade to the sides. Typically, these deeper trenches were set back from the most advanced defensive positions, designed to provide the defending army with a secure position from which to hold off enemy advance. At Beersheba, troops of the 4th and 12th Light Horse charged towards trench lines like these, attacking from the front and rear, as well as from above as their whalers jumped over the Ottoman soldiers. Mounted troop charges were very effective at disorienting and panicking entrenched soldiers, as the speed at which the charge occurred overwhelmed their reaction time. Signals intelligence, or SIGINT, was one of the three arms of intelligence gathering used during the Sinai-Palestine campaign, which also included the use of photography, particularly aerial reconnaissance, known as IMINT, and human intelligence, HUMINT, which involved the use of agents in the field. In order to telegraph messages over the great distances of the deserts of Sinai and Palestine in support of their division's efforts in the field, signallers of the Anzac Mounted Division would set up their long-range communications equipment atop hills in order to give themselves clear lines of sight over which to transmit and receive intelligence. This same high ground also gave them a vantage from which to survey their surrounds.
Here's your light today.
The heliograph was a modest but effective instrument for instantaneous optical communication over these long distances and had been used since the late 19th century and continued as standard issue in the British and Australian armies into the 1960s. The heliograph is a wireless solar telegraph which transmits signals by flashes of sunlight reflected through a mirror. Signal is generally communicated in Morse code using flashes produced by momentarily pivoting the mirror or by interrupting the reflected sunbeam with a shutter. The heliograph allowed long-distance communication without a fixed infrastructure by allowing a mobile network of signallers to communicate instantaneous messages relayed across tremendous distances for as long as the sun was available to them. Whilst telephonic forms of communication still required wire to be laid at this stage of the war, and the practical use of wireless radio communications was still in its infancy, more modest and practical equipment, such as the heliograph and signal lamp, proved highly effective in the field. The horses of the Australian light horse were known as whalers. Whaler was a name used to describe all horses sent initially from New South Wales, and later from any part of Australia, from 1836 to 1940.
Cheer up, mate.
Born and bred in the outback, whalers were typically resilient horses able to travel long distances in hot weather with little water and poor foraging.
Ready.
During the First World War, about 139,000 whalers were transported overseas from outback stations, and their particular association with the Australian light horse in Palestine remains indelible to this day.
Good.
The bond that formed between a trooper and his horse was an elemental part of the light horse experience, but was broken at the end of the war as troopers and their horses were forced to separate.
That's arse and peak, mate.
11,000 of these horses were sold to the British Army, whilst others, categorised as unfit, were destroyed. In some cases, troopers did this personally, a task they found extremely difficult to endure.
Poor fella's totally rattled.
Second Lieutenant Oliver Trooper Bluegum Hogue reflected on the anguish felt in deciding to destroy his own horse. I don't think I could stand the thought of my old fancy hack just crawling around old Cairo with a jippo on his back. Perhaps some English tourist out in Palestine may find my broken-hearted whaler with a wooden plough behind. No, I think I'd better shoot him and tell a little lie. He floundered in a wombat hole and then lay down to die. Maybe I'll get court-martialed, but I'm damned if I'm inclined to go back to Australia and leave my horse behind. Of Beersheba in 1917, with its town square surrounded by civic and religious buildings. During the Battle of Beersheba, the 12th and 4th Australian Light Horse charged from the southeast and circuited the outskirts before occupying the town in the early evening of the 31st October 1917, followed up by other troops of the Desert Mounted Corps. The naming of Beersheba, also Beersheva, is intrinsically related to water. Beer is the Hebrew word for well, and it was the capture of 17 wells that was so crucial to the measure of Allied success at the Battle of Beersheba. Ottoman and German command was successful in destroying only 2 of these 17 wells before the Allied forces took control of the town. During the Ottoman era, Beersheba is regarded as becoming the first Bedouin city, reflecting a desire by governing officials to attempt to settle nomadic Bedouin communities, a scheme that saw considerable success. The distinct grid shape to the layout of the town was developed by Swiss, German, and Palestinian architects. Since 1917, Beersheba has grown into a major city, extending this grid and within which this older area is now found nestled in the southern districts. On the edge of this old city is a Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemetery, containing the graves of Australian, New Zealand, and British soldiers. Beersheba also contains a memorial park, Australian Soldier Park, dedicated to the memory of the Australian Light Horse regiments who captured the town on 31st October 1917.